thank you so much for being here on this beautiful Saturday. And thank you for your presence throughout these 3 days. It's been wonderful. We had a wonderful event last night to mark a milestone in the history of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, our 10th anniversary. So thank you for attending that. I'm going to be chairing the first session this morning, but before that, and I know I gave a plug for our journal yesterday, but I'm going to do it again for our audience also online. Manuscript Studies, Volume 8.2 has just arrived this week. And of course, that's timed. We produce it to twice a year, and we time the fall issue to come out in time for the symposium. And many of you actually in the audience have contributed articles and book reviews and annotations. So we thank you for that. And we announced this a few weeks ago, but I just wanted to repeat this news that we have shifted the journal from a one-year paywall to Diamond Open Access as of January 1st, 2024. And so the journal will become entirely freely available as soon as it's published to audiences worldwide. And we hope that this will drive even more engagement, even more submissions, and even more scholarship. So please bear the journal in mind for research on any aspect of manuscript studies from a global perspective, and annotations as well, which are shorter reports on projects and observations. And also, I co-edit the journal with Lynn, and we have Amy Hutchins as our wonderful book review editor. So if you know of a book that you think should be reviewed, please let her know. So again, Manuscript Studies, it will still be available in print, but also online in open access. So this morning, our first session is devoted to the theme of identities. And it's a pleasure to introduce Emine Fetvacı, who is Associate Professor of Islamic Art at Boston University. Her research areas include the arts of the book in the Islamic world, and also Ottoman, Mughal, and Safavid art and architecture more generally. And she recently published in 2019 with Princeton University Press, The Album of the World Emperor, Cross-Cultural Collecting and Album Making at the Ottoman Court. And among her many publications, I want to call to mind a couple that really pertain to our subject over these few days. The image of the book, Ottoman Author Portraits in the Early Modern Period, from an edited volume, Emotions and Subjectivity in the Early Modern Islamic World, Brill from 2017, and an important article from 2013 in the Art Bulletin, From Print to Trace, an Ottoman Imperial Portrait Book and its Western European models. And this morning, she will be speaking to us about the image of the book at the Ottoman court. Emine.
Good morning. I'd like to start with a thank you to Nick and to Lynn for the invitation and for the warm hospitality. It's wonderful to be here. I will also make a little correction. I'm not at BU anymore. I've been at BC for 3 years. So just for the record. But it's a real pleasure to be surrounded by book people. So thank you for the invitation. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Ottoman court artists began to produce serial portraits of their rulers during the reign of the Sultan Murad III between 1574 and 1595. Serial portraits first made their appearance in 1579, illustrating a book of physiognomy with a focus on the sultans. The types established for the individual rulers in this series were used in palace-sponsored projects throughout the reign of Murad III. In these series, Murad is portrayed with a book in his hand. And you can see him. Oops, sorry, wrong button. There's this red book. And codex-centric, or rather illustrated codex-centric art historian that I am, that many of us are who have looked at these, we had assumed this was because he's renowned as a bibliophile, a great patron of illustrated manuscripts. But you'll soon see that this was not the whole story. In an unusual fashion for the Ottoman court, where most illustrated histories were made as unique objects, 12 illustrated copies of this book of physiognomy/imperial biographies were made. Perhaps as a result of the multiple copies, or simply reflecting the desire to establish a recognizable image for each ruler, the iconography presented in the 1579 project took hold of the Ottoman artistic and political imagination for quite a while. A second project, including serial portraits, continuing these set types, the Zübdetü Tevari, or the quintessence of histories, was produced in 3 illustrated copies between 1583 and 1586. This is a universal history come genealogy of the Ottoman house that includes around 40 images in each manuscript, or each copy. The image cycle starts with a depiction of the celestial sphere, then continues with narrative scenes of Adam and Eve and Old Testament prophets, of Jesus and of the Prophet Muhammad, followed by portraits of important figures from early Islamic history, and culminating in the portraits of the 12 Ottoman rulers up to and including Murat III, the patron for whom the project was done. All 3 copies end with the image of Murat. So here I'm showing you the copy that was made for the chief white eunuch of the palace. This one was made for the Sultan, and the one on the right was made for the Grand Vizier, Siyavush Pasha. All 3 copies end, as you see, with Murat seated and holding a book in one hand, accompanied by attendants in 2 cases and by himself in one. No other rulers in the quintessence of histories, or for that matter in the other series, are shown with a book. Some of them have a handkerchief as an attribute, signaling refinement, and one is shown with a flower. They're mostly differentiated by their clothes, turbans, and pose. Both books, The Human Physiognomy and The Likeness of the Ottomans, as well as The Human Physiognomy and the Likeness of the Ottomans, that's the title, long title of one book, as well as The Quintessence of Histories, were written by the same author, the official court historian Said Lokman el-Ashuri, who held this post throughout the reign of Murat III. Although Ottoman book paintings are generally team-produced, both projects also had the same artist, Nakkash Osman, as the lead painter. The author-artist combination explains, to a certain extent, the consistencies between the 2 books, as does the fact that Murat was the patron of both projects. But that's not the whole story. In the context of the broader field of Islamic art, the depiction of a ruler holding a book is a novelty. The 2 images on the screen, on the left from the Mughal court in India, and on the right, the Timurid court from Herat in the late 15th century, show the more common fashion in which rulers and books come together in paintings. These function both as author portraits and patron portraits, but the person holding the book is the author presenting it to the ruler, and the same thing is true over here. So the person holding the book is the author and not the patron. Similarly, the Ottomans also depicted rulers in the vicinity of books, in a room full of bookshelves, for example, in both of these cases. So here, these are books laid on their side, and over here on either side of Murat, there are shelves with books on them. So here they're shown in a room full of bookshelves, or there are other images with rulers being presented books, but no rulers other than Murat are actually shown holding a book. The ruler holding a book is, therefore, a new iconography created for Murat III by Said Lokman and Nakkash Osman. So what did it mean? What was its significance? Perhaps a look at the images of other people depicted with books can tell us. Unsurprisingly, the people who get to hold books in paintings, in Ottoman paintings, are usually scholars, authors, and thinkers. So on the left, we have the author Talikizadeh in green, who's writing the book. We have the calligrapher or the scribe across from him at work on a project, and the artist Nakash Hassan. So they're the ones in close contact with books. Here, this is Talikizadeh again in a room full of books, praying with a book under his arm. And then on the right is a planning image of the Shehnameh of Selim II with a grand historian, Karabai, sitting there in the same pose as the Sultan, actually, holding the book. And then we have the author of the book itself, Lokman, here pictured, as well as the artist, scribe, and illuminator, sorry. And then in the background, we have servants bringing in books. So perhaps when we see an image of Murat III holding a book, we're also supposed to associate him with the qualities of scholarship, of knowledge, of wisdom. This is definitely part of it, but I would simply be stating the obvious if I left it there. To understand the full implications of the image properly, let's return to the two projects in which Murat appears for the first time with a book in his hand. This one, the very first one, the 1579 book of imperial portraiture, the text describing his appearance and character describes him as more, and here I'm translating from the Ottoman, piously scrupulous, as more piously scrupulous, Sharia following, and just than any other ruler who had the honor of carrying the title Caliph. He's also said to have, again I translate, turned increasingly toward God and always strove to act in accordance with the Sharia. He did not favor anything other than or more than devotion and surrounded himself with scholars and sheikhs, which means Sufi teachers and religio-legal scholars. His participation in the Halveti Sufi order is also hinted at through the choice of words referring to how he liked to wake up in the middle of the night to say his prayers. Halveti leyalide meşgul oldukları zikr. The text then moves on to the military successes of the army under him and attributes those to his acquisition of the sword of the Prophet Muhammad, which is said to be the most powerful relic of all time in the text. After a poem lauding the Sultan in similar terms, Lokman moves on to describe his appearance in accordance with the physiognomic principles outlined in the beginning of the text. So the book of physiognomy lays particular emphasis on Murat's piety, following the Sharia, and surrounding himself with scholars and saints, scholars and Sufis. Even his military successes are attributed to the discovery of a relic from the Prophet. In the image cycle, the book in the Sultan's hand probably then stands for his piety and his appreciation of the Sharia. The hilt of the sword visible here, which I hadn't paid that much attention to until I started writing this paper, this is not just any sword, this is the sword of the Prophet probably, because the other figures that I'm showing you here, Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople, and Selim I, who is renowned in Ottoman history, at least for his massive conquests, neither one of these very military rulers are shown with a sword. Murat, though, who didn't leave the palace except to go pray after his accession, is shown here with a sword in his hands. So that's got to be not just any sword, but the sword that was miraculously discovered during his reign, the most powerful relic of all time. So I've already argued 10 years ago in that in my first book and the article that Nick kindly mentioned, that the means through which the Ottoman ruler was idealized changed significantly during the reign of Murat III. Prior to Murat, rulers had been lauded in court histories for their actions as ideal rulers. These texts were accompanied by narrative paintings showing the sultans leading the army to prove their military prowess, meeting with ambassadors or their subjects to dispense justice, or depicted hunting on horseback to demonstrate their marksmanship and bravery. In histories composed during the reign of Murat III, however, the ideal ruler came to be lauded for his moral character. Who he was, rather than what he did, qualified him to be a good ruler. That's why a genealogy such as this one and a book of portraits becomes important. And accordingly, we begin to see portraits rather than narrative scenes begin to take on importance in imperial depiction. I find it significant that at the moment that this change is happening, the ruler whose lifestyle made it impossible to praise him as an action hero, because he simply wasn't, begins to be portrayed with a book. The book then appears as the symbol of his piety, his morality, and even perhaps his caliphate. Murat's portrait with a book is also a key to understanding the goals of the Zübdetü Tevarih, the Quintessence of Histories project, itself a part of the palace's effort to create a new positive image for Murat III. The Zübdetü Tevarih is essentially a book of genealogy that connects the Ottoman dynasty to Noah. The genealogical chain also constitutes a universal history. It presents a genealogy for the Ottomans that's the perfect embodiment of what 16th century Ottoman scholars were fabricating in contemporaneous works. As Hüseyin Yılmaz puts it, and I quote it from him here, a noble lineage that infused Abrahamic, Persian, and Turco-Mongolian traditions of origination that not only tied the Ottoman dynasty to prestigious empires of antiquity, but also Islamized its lineage and portrayed it as divinely ordained to rule. Beyond a genealogy fusing Islamic and Persian traditions, the book presents an ideal for the Ottoman ruler that heavily leans on Islamic notions. Ottoman rulers are conceived here as heirs to the Prophet Muhammad and depicted in similar ways to the first four caliphs of Islam, as can be seen through a comparison of their portraits on the screen. So here are the first four caliphs: Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, and Osman. Khalife, or the Ottoman for caliph, is the term that is, well, it has other meanings too, and that's what's activated here. It's the term that's frequently used in the text to refer to important figures, and the themes of the narratives are about succession among prophets, and the term Khalifa has to do with being the successor. So succession among prophets, leading people to the right path, and grace or majesty. Baki Tezcan argues that the Zübdetü Tevarih presents the Ottoman dynasty as the seal of the dynasties, just as the Prophet Muhammad is conceived as the seal of the prophets, the last one, the very last one. In addition to the book in his hand, in all three copies, Murat is depicted in all of them with the sword of the Prophet as well, held by his sword bearer beside him in two of the images and visible under his kaftan in one. So it's over here, and then this guy's holding it, and there it is for him. The author Lokman lists in the text the miraculous discovery of the sword by a villager, and then he he lists the previous owners of the sword in the surrounding text. The Mamluk ruler Baybars al-Bundukdari, who inherited it from the Abbasids in Baghdad, who in turn got it from the Umayyads, who had gotten it from the Caliph Omar, to whom the Prophet had given the sword. The provenance of the sword is given so we easily connect the Prophet and the Sultan. And while two of the first four caliphs here hold swords, one is renowned for his conquests, Umar in red above, and the other in green below him, Ali, known for his two-pronged sword, nobody is holding books in the imperial copy of the Zubdet. But in the copy made for the Grand Vizier, from which these images are taken, two of the caliphs are shown with books, if not in their hands, at least right next to them. So here we have Abu Bakr here with a Quran stand and I don't think this is a book because of the way the envelope flap is on the outside, but it's clearly something that contains documents. And then down here, next to Osman, who's renowned for having collated the whole copy of the Quran, we see an inkstand, an ink pot, a little table, and a green book next to it. The people holding books in the image in the middle are the four legal scholars of Sunni Islam: Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik ibn Anas, Imam Muhammad al-Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal, the forerunners of the scholars and jurists with whom Murat is said to have surrounded himself in the description from the physiognomy book I translated a few minutes ago. And they are actively reading. They're not just holding books, they're actually reading them, unlike the Sultan, who's simply holding on to it. So the sword and the book help to visually connect Murat III to the Prophet Muhammad, as well as these important figures from the history of Islam who represent the establishment of various legal and religious traditions. The image of the book, then, is actively being used in these two projects to end an air of legalistic piety to Murat III. Here, hopefully, I've answered my first question about the significance of the book in Murat's hands. Together with the sword, it presents him as heir to these forerunners. There's another way in which this Zubdet-i Tevari project encourages us to think about the image of the book, but this time it's a less literal and a more conceptual image. The quintessence of histories is actually a translation into codex format of a mid-16th century Ottoman genealogical scroll, the Tomar-u Humayun, or Imperial Scroll. This extraordinary scroll on the screen now, or bits of it, because it's impossible to get the whole thing, was created during the reign of Süleyman I by his official court historians Arif and Eflatun. It's a genealogical tree of the House of Osman that also incorporates text around and in between the illuminated medallions bearing the names of the Ottoman rulers and their ancestors. It is 31.16 meters long and 79 centimeters wide. That's why I can't show you a picture of the whole thing. It's a Leviathan artistic and historical work. After an account, so it begins up here, and then the first thing it tells us is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and so we get the celestial sphere illustrating that part. The genealogy proper begins with Adam and Eve, whose names are together in two medallions inside that green one. It ends with Mehmet III on the, oh, I didn't put him here. It ends with Mehmet III, Murad's son, who reigned from 1595 to 1603. During his reign, we think, the scroll was expanded to include the three sultans after Süleyman, for whom the scroll was made in the 1550s. And these are Selim II, so Süleyman's son, his grandson Murat III, my man with the book, and then his son Mehmet III. Many of the figures named in the Tomar have narrative text, as you can see, lots of narrative bits and pieces of text here, relating their stories, written in different angles and different directions to form beautiful geometric patterns, as well as hint at imagery, such as a pair of scales, the scales of justice, of course, on the right there. Starting with Süleyman, here, starting with Süleyman, the narrative accounts of the Ottoman rulers are written straight across the scroll and don't leave room for anything or anyone else. So it starts for Murat too, it starts like this, and then it expands, and then it continues like this for miles, I want to say, for meters. The genealogy begins at the top of the scroll with Adam and Eve at the center. And then after Noah, the tree splits into three branches with the descendants of Noah's son Japheth on the left, while the descendants of Ham are on the right side. There are multiple unconnected genealogies running down the sides of the scroll that include other rulers of the past. The left side features some Shahnameh heroes, which is a Persian epic from the 11th century. the Book of Kings, and a Mongol genealogy, while the right side includes a Sufi genealogy titled Silsile-i Tarikat, or the chain of the orders. It also has the Abbasid rulers and lists the rulers of Egypt, beginning with the Tulunids and continuing with the Fatimids. So 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. The central column of the scroll, which contains the Ottomans at the end, goes through Noah and Sam to Abraham and includes various Old Testament figures: Jesus, John the Baptist, and then the Prophet Muhammad, the first 4 caliphs of Sunni Islam, 11 of the 12 Shi'i imams, and Avicenna. They're not all connected to each other with lines, but are lined up one after the other to form a single visual unit, all the same. The Ottoman line descends from Yafeth through a Turco-Mongol genealogy, who are all in the left branch. And then, see, this line comes across from the left to the middle, does 3 little bounces, and then this green one is Avicenna, and underneath him we have the name of Aykut-Almış, a Turkic ancestor of the Ottomans, and the line then goes from his name straight down to the Ottoman rulers down here, whose names are much bigger medallions than the others. The Ottomans are not connected with an actual line to the prophet or his descendants, yet this visual connection with the moving from the left to the right, to the left to the center, is creates this link between the Ottomans and the prophet and the imams and Avicenna. So the scroll proposes a lofty legacy for the Ottomans that fuses Abrahamic, Persian, and Turco-Mongolian traditions, and ties them to prestigious empires of the past, as well as the Prophet Muhammad and his family, thereby portraying them as divinely ordained to rule. The scroll is a magnificent artwork, but it's also an anomaly. Why, in an era of codex production, did Arif and Eflatun choose to create a scroll rather than a codex? Now, to be sure, there were smaller scrolls that were made with imperial decrees on them or used for other documents, but nothing like this. The answer appears to lie in the genealogical trees in the Topkapı treasury that might have inspired them. An obvious candidate is the well-known Timurid genealogy contained in the Timurid album H2152, shown here, which arrived in the Ottoman treasury during the reign of Selim I, so in the early 16th century, 1512 to 20. Like the Tomar, the Timurid genealogy was originally a vertical document, most likely a scroll. Differently from the Tomar, however, its circular medallions contain portraits, not just names. The incorporation of portraits into a genealogy here has been mentioned as a model for the Zübdet-i Tevarih, the quintessence of histories, by other scholars, of course, but I want to linger for a moment on its sheer format, in particular its vertical orientation. The vertical 15th century scroll was eventually cut up and incorporated into a codex in the second half of the 15th century before arriving at the Ottoman court. It now had a clear margin all around it, you can see here, and conformed to the shape of a codex. However, the codex format was not quite appropriate here, as the vertical scroll forced viewers to turn the codex on its side for proper viewing. And up here, I show it to you as the orientation of the book would be. A second genealogical scroll in the Topkapı treasury, important for us here, is Rashid ad-Din's Shu'ab-ı Pençgane. This was originally composed in 1300, but the manuscript that you see on the screen in the Topkapı collections dates from the early 16th century. The codex on the right side of the screen was either copied from a scroll or simply takes a scroll and cuts it up without adding margins. And you can see the red lines of the genealogy going all the way down to the edge of the book. And the lines in the text are oriented perpendicular to the codex pages and run from one page to the next. It has squares or circles left blank with the names of individuals over them, suggesting that it was meant to be illustrated with portraits. This was undoubtedly one of the conceptual models of the Tomar and its illuminated circles bearing the names in the genealogical tree. The Shuabi Pençgane, this one on the right, like our scroll Tomar, includes historical narratives around the medallions. And you can see some here, down here, to supplement the genealogical information provided by the tree. And this too seems to have been deemed a good practice by the makers of the Ottoman scroll. Rashid-ad-Din used and explicitly discussed his choices of specific color schemes and geometric codifications for different families and genealogies. This was also adopted by the makers of the Tomar. You can see that the different lines here, medallions, these ones are blue, this family is green and red, etc. Such visual markers are used here to great effect. One last link between the Ottoman Tomar and the Shuab is in their visual organization. The whole Shuabi Pençgane is organized around a central branch, two solid lines that go from the beginning of the genealogy to the end. From Adam to Ghazan Khan, the last ruler in the genealogy and the author's patron. They represent what the author Rashid-ad-Din calls the pillar of the lineage. Likewise, the Tomar consists of a central pillar which starts with Adam and Eve and includes the Prophet Muhammad and the Ottoman rulers, accompanied by other pillars branching out to the sides. The fact that the Ottoman line is brought into the central pillar at a certain point, like I showed earlier, even though it's not connected to the others above it with actual lines, shows us how important this central column was deemed to be. The makers of the Tomar were aware that there were not actual blood connections between the Ottomans and the Prophet, but they made use of the suggestive power of the central column. The line connecting the ancestors of the House of Osman really does a lot of work to sort of move over to the right-hand side. It's deliberate and visually interesting, in fact, eye-catching. And it's quite possible that this was a response to Rashid-ad-Din's idea of the pillar of the lineage at the center. So the makers of the Tomar looked at these two on the right. Once a scroll, but now codex examples, and they wanted to create a scroll. The makers of the Quintessence of Histories, the next step, however, wanted to make a book, a codex that carried traces of a scroll. Like the two Ilhanid and Timurid examples we've been looking at, the Quintessence too has lines of a genealogy running across with medallion names on it. But they run across the pages from right to left and continue horizontally from page to page, not from the top of the page to the bottom. And unlike the Ilhanid and Timurid genealogies, the Zubdet's text is also oriented as one would expect in a codex, running from right to left and down the page. However, the stories rarely run all the way down the page. Instead, the pages are frequently separated into two sections, one story continuing in the top part and another in the lower portion, and they go across multiple folios. The related images are included in the appropriate part of the folio too. Despite this, the orientation of the book is clearly like a typical codex rather than one you would turn on its side to read or to look at, which is the case for the Ilhanid and Timurid example models. The genealogical lines and the text and images of the Zubdet are fully contained within the text block of the book. They stop at the wide blank margins long before the edge of the page. So even obviously here, and then I also want to point to the lines in the back that are sort of running almost behind the painting, or suggested to be that way. In the Timurid genealogy, this happens because the genealogy, it has margins because it was incorporated into an album, and framed accordingly. In the case of the Zubdet, this is the design of the book from the beginning. If it were simply a matter of conceptually cutting up a vertical scroll and binding it as a codex, the lines would run all the way to the edge of the folios, as they do in the previous, in the example on the right, in the Shuab-ı Penjgane, or they might run vertically, as they do in later Ottoman silsilenames. Yet here, other choices were made. The author, artists, and scribes of the Zubdet-ü Tevari wanted to produce a codex that clearly adhered to their notion of what a codex should be, their image of a book. The authenticity of that book, however, rested somewhat on its having been copied from a scroll. So they alluded to the scroll original through lines running across the pages, connecting circles with names in them, as a genealogical scroll does, but they do so in a codex that was planned from the beginning to be and to look like a book. And it's the image of that book as a codex that helped to create a positive public identity for Murad as a pious Sunni Muslim ruler who followed in the traditions of the Prophet, the caliphs, and the Imam jurists, all here in his lineage. Thank you.
Thank you, Emine, for that wonderful talk, and I'm sure there'll be lots to discuss about the similarities and differences with other non-codex or codex-adjacent forms in other traditions. Thank you. Our next speaker is Thomas Rayner, who's an art historian specializing in many aspects of medieval book culture. He is a scientific assistant in the Textures of Sacred Scriptures project, an important project out of the University of Zurich. And he completed a PhD dissertation on the early medieval book covers of the Longobard queen, Theodolinda. Fascinating topic. And he's published on many aspects of early and high medieval illumination. In particular, and with regard to the topic of our symposium, in 2019, he published an article, Adoring God's Name, Images of the Torah Case and Its Erasure in Medieval Jewish and Christian Manuscripts, in a volume, Clothing Sacred Scriptures, Book Art and Book Religion in Christian, Islamic, and Jewish Cultures. And today he will be speaking to us on imagining religious identity and difference through book formats. Thomas.
So thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm especially glad that I can speak today on a topic a little bit different than what I do in the Textures of Sacred Scripture project, where I work on purple manuscripts. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about was purple, but now I return to a research topic that I have done before. I was fascinated by the conference, and especially by the talk of Sonja Drinmar yesterday, who told us that this teleological vision of a succession from codex to scroll is based on ideology. And I will speak about a similar topic from another point of view, from the point of view of Jewish book history. And when you look at the screen, you see the depiction of a Machzor with a Torah ark, and inside or outside of this Torah ark, you don't see a scroll, but you see an open codex. So this image puts shows us that this notion to identify Judaism with the scroll and Christianity with the open codex is ideology based, and I will talk a little bit about the roots of this and the development of this. I begin this paper with two very different depictions of one and the same scene. Chapter 4 of the Gospel, according to Luke, describes how Jesus came to Nazareth and went to the synagogue, as his custom was on Sabbath day. and I quote the Revised Standard Version, he stood up to read, and there was given to him a book of the prophet Jesaja. He opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the good news to the poor." This stunning self-declaration of messianic calling is the only account of Jesus handling a book in the Gospels. It does not tell us the format of the book. The Greek expression biblion used by Luke is generic for a book. It can mean scroll or codex. One of the two Greek verbs that, according to our earliest textual evidence, is designate the opening of the book, anaptyxas, meaning to unfold or unroll, could hint either at a scroll or a document in letter form, a diptych, such as Georgios showed us yesterday, or even at a codex. However, the evidence assembled by Roger Baniel for this sense of the word to mean opening a codex is not conclusive. Even if we suppose that the text written by Luke was altered in the 2nd century, Luke wrote in at the end of the 1st century, it was then that we find the first evidence for Christian gospel books in codex format. At the same time, when Christians adopted the codex as their preferred format for the gospel book at the end of the 1st and the 2nd century, rabbinical Judaism began to develop rules not to write liturgically used scripture on any other medium than the scroll. From the very start of its usage as a medium for writing sacred text, the codex was set on a polemical course of religious identity building reflected in its image. Also, the reading of Luke 4:17 does not support the identification of Jesus' book as codex. In nearly all depictions of the scene up to the 19th century, it is an open codex and not a scroll he is holding. The opening of the codex carried a strong ideological underpinning, as can be seen on the slide on the left. The depiction of Jesus in the synagogue as opening scene and very first picture in the Menologion of Basil II, produced around the year 1000 in Constantinople. The unfolding of the text in the transformative act of folding back the outer covers translate the transformation of the supposedly hidden prophetic message into Christian messianic self-revelation into a striking image. It is not by chance that we read the word Christos, the anointed one, as heading on the right-hand page. The codex thus unfolded with the embodied symbol of Christ is positioned as at a literal turning point in Christian salvation history, turning open the closed book. The backside of this story was the relegation of the continuing media history of the scroll to a background noise of the codex, paralleled with Christian triumph, as has been shown by Sonja Trimmer yesterday. This is the reason why an image of the same scene with Jesus reading from a scroll in a Jewish synagogue setting creates a surprising contrast. In his quest to depict the historic Jesus, the late 19th century French artist James Tissot based his image on sketches he made in the Maghrebinian and Sephardic synagogues of Jerusalem. As a document of the historic Jesus, this depiction is, of course, no less anachronistic than the open codex. The teak, the Torah case, on its wooden stand dates from the 19th century. With its silver-decorated elements, a cypress tree, and the Khamsa symbol to protect from the evil eye, it is similar to a slightly later Torah case from the 1940s, now in the Gross family collection from Jerusalem, and it was originally stored in the Jerusalem Yochanan ben Zakkai synagogue. And it is exactly there where Tissot was drawing his sketches for this depiction of Jesus reading from a teak. Silver-decorated Torah cases like this are first documented in our written sources not earlier than the 11th century. Tissot's image builds a historical construction with carefully selected elements of contemporary Jewish liturgical practice, which he projects into an orientalized past. The result is once again a temporal scheme that distorts the contemporary media history of scroll and codex by attributing them to different pasts. However, the incorporation of realistically depicted elements of supposedly a supposedly suspended media history of the scroll from contemporary Jewish liturgical practice creates a tension which is worth further exploring. I will do this not on this painting by Tissot, but on a late medieval depiction of scroll and codex, which is a very famous one and on which some of you have already worked. 34 years ago, in his pioneering work on the Gothic idol, the art historian Michael Camille drew attention to an exceptional full-page miniature at the beginning of the French translation of Augustine's City of God by Raoul Prel, in which the open codex stands at the center of Christian salvation history. The manuscript is one of the earliest copies of Raoul de Prel's translation of Augustine's City of God from the Royal Library of King Charles V, produced between 1375 and 1380. Between the heavenly state above and hell below, the history of the world is divided in 3 different stages. To the left of the central salvatory axis, which revolves around the open codex book, around the open gospel book on the altar, the pagans turn their back to the Christian revelation. Instead of the open codex, the chalice, and the crucifix, which reveal the Word made flesh, they adore 2 naked golden statues. To the right, the era sublegem under Mosaic law is depicted by the high priest with an exotic crown and the Jews with pointed heads holding a small ram as a sacrificial animal. The high priest offers incense to a curious shrine standing with 1 foot on a sort of altar. A scroll winds out of this gray, ungilded ark, averting the gaze of the kneeling Jews from the open codex behind their backs. Describing this scene, Michael Camille noted, "This is not a depiction of the Torah scroll as seen in a Jewish manuscript. Out of this ark spurts a speech scroll, the word of Jehovah, the booming voice of Old Testament God." End of quote. Indeed, the Ark of Covenant here resembles more an undefined, veiled reliquary rather than a Torah ark. While the liturgical place and presence of the Christian word at the altar are clearly defined by the open codex and the chalice, framing it in an elaborately adorned liturgical setting with contemporary dressed viewers, the unadorned and uninscribed scroll is shown floating away. The fantastic costume of the high priest contributes to this marginalization of any contemporary real visual presence and refers the scroll to a bygone past. Idol worship and the Jewish adoration of scripture are contrasted both to the contemporary Christian liturgy combining word and image, open codex and crucifix, body and book. And Professor Hamburger has written extensively about this. However, this was not the only instance in that this scene was depicted. We find a similar juxtaposition of idol worship, Jewish rite, and Christian liturgy also in 3 later copies of Raoul de Prel's translation of Augustine's City of God. Here, a stunning transformation can be observed. An element of contemporary Jewish liturgical practice is introduced and updates the scene. The best example is a luxurious manuscript, which was probably commissioned by the royal councillor Maurice Cloverrier around the year 1425 from the Parisian book painting workshop of the so-called Valerius Maximus master. The basic structure of the frontispiece, and I go back, is similar to the older manuscript. Above, the heaven is ruled by the Trinity, featuring an open codex in the center of the depiction. Below, hell is divided in 3 scenes of diverse banishment. In the register in between, once again, idol worship and the Jewish adoration of the scroll are contrasted to the Christian Mass, featuring open codex, chalice, crucifix on the altar. But when we look in detail, the depiction of the Jewish rite has changed considerably. The high priest with his grotesque headgear is missing, and the noble costumes of the kneeling Jewish congregation are not at all different from the contemporary dressed Christians celebrating Mass. Both are differentiated from the idol worshippers to the left, whose dress and turban-covered heads, as well as a hijab for a woman, identify them as Saracen or people from the Islamic East. Most stunningly, the focus of Jewish worship is clearly defined. We see here one of the earliest realistic depictions of a Torah ark in Christian art, which looks similar to the depiction of the ark in contemporary Jewish manuscripts. On the right side of the slide is shown the interior of a synagogue with a Torah ark depicted in a famous Hebrew manuscript from Mantua, dated around the year 1435, which is approximately to the same time period as the French manuscript. Except for stylistic differences and other material, a greater abundance of details in the Italian miniature, the basic structure of the arks is the same. It is a 2-story architecture with a pyramid-shaped and exquisitely decorated gilded roof. The upper compartment, which rests on a base with elongated blind arcades or Gothic tracery, is opened by a single rectangular door. In the miniature of the Hebrew book, the outline of a wrapped Torah scroll can be seen behind the open door, facing the congregation, while in the French illumination, the opening is the starting point of the curled speech scroll. So here you have the configuration with the speech scroll, and you can see behind the door this depiction of a scroll in its textile cover. If we widen the site, the composition of the Italian illuminator, who has been linked to a local book painting workshop in Mantua, becomes clearer. It depicts the return of the Torah scroll after its ceremonial reading. We can still see the cantor behind the reading desk, while the bearded man places the scroll wrapped tightly in a pressure thread Torah mantle in the upper compartment of the ark. The whole congregation, all men and women, are wrapped in white prayer shawls, dalitot, which cover the head and shoulders and are marked by scissored ritual threads. The amount of informed detail of Jewish ritual customs makes it likely that the ark represents a fairly accurate image of this type of Torah shrine, which Ilya Rodov, in his extensive iconographic study of similar depictions in Hebrew manuscripts, designated as tower-like. I show here, for comparison, 2 other depictions of the same sort of Torah shrine. One from a manuscript of the Mishneh Torah, produced in Perugia in around 1400, and the other one in a Machzor, dated to the middle of the 15th century. Interesting in this big depiction is that this pyramidal shaped roof is crowned by a corona of lights. This has, of course, Old Testament significance, reaching back to the Ark of Covenant with its corona. It is clear from these comparisons that the Christian artist had a very specific image of a Jewish Torah ark in mind when he depicted Judaism in Augustine's treaty. How can we then imagine this introduction of the Torah ark into Christian art? And what does it mean for the pictorial juxtaposition of scroll and codex? We know that this was not a singular one-off invention, but that the artist followed a particular recension of the scene. Two other copies of the Cité de Dieu contain a variant of the ark. I show here first a manuscript of Northern French provenance with the same scene from around 1400, now in the Bibliothèque Municipale de Boulogne, and compare this to another slightly later copy of lower quality in which the artist no longer understood the depiction correctly and substituted it with a simple rectangle crowned by the still gilded pyramid roof. So here you see a single rectangle, which is in the same place as the Torah ark depicted in the other manuscript. It is reasonable to assume that the original model was much more detailed and that the artist designing it either knew a Jewish manuscript with a depiction of a Torah ark or even a real ark. After several expulsions and brutal persecutions in the first half of the 14th century, Jews were readmitted to France under the rulership of King Charles V and were able to establish a new synagogue in Paris. Marshal Kupfer has shown the pronounced and intensive interest of the king in Jewish affairs and Hebrew letters, as well as the direct involvement of the crown in dealing with Hebrew manuscripts from the king's library. The short flowering of the Jewish community in Paris ended in 1394 with Charles' successor, when the Jews were again permanently expulsed from France. I think it is in this short period between 1360 and 1394 that the model for the realistic Torah ark was introduced in the courtly books production. Therein, two different trends can be observed to affirm the Christian triumph of the Codex in comparison with the Jewish scrolls. On the one hand, the scroll was relegated to an idolatric past, associating the Jews in their costume and practice to devilishly loot Saracens from Islamic lands, as we saw in the earlier manuscript. On the other hand, the scroll was given a legitimate liturgical setting with an ark conveying a contemporary Jewish liturgical practice, not equal to the Christian one, but ennobled by the proper ornament rooted in a common Old Testament symbolism. Here once again, this image with this depiction of the Torah ark. When in the 18th century, this typological interpretation joined force with a general critique of the materiality and superfluousness of religious rites of any stripe, Christian as well as Jewish, the Augustinian tradition became a starting point for the comparison of the same book formats in different cults. Here you see the title vignette of one of the most famous works of religious comparisons in pictures, Bernard and Picard's monumental pictorial encyclopedia Cérémonies et coutumes religieuses de tous les peuples du monde, Ceremonies and Religious Customs of All People of the World, published in Amsterdam in 1723. The general layout and many surprising details of this title vignette follow the model set by the illumination of pagans, Christians, and Jews in the French translation of Augustine's City of God. But there are also certain differences that should be noted. Instead of 3 depictions of different religious cults, we now find 4. Augustine's idolaters have been split into 2 different groups, whereas the medieval tradition lumped Saracens and idolatry together. Here, Muslim worship is separated from the cult of idolaters who adore no longer gilded statues, but the sun and the stars. And this is the split up scene of idolatry, where idolaters adore the sky with sun and stars, and you see a depiction of Islam with a Muslim praying. By this doubling, Christianity, which is labeled here as Catholicism, thus distinguishing its material cult from Protestantism, has lost its central position. It is paired with Islam to the right, and with Judaism to the left. Especially the comparison of Judaism and Christianity refer back to older typological models that were updated by the custom of the Jews. Their cult is characterized by a scroll that is not shown as realistically depicted Torah scroll, but resembles the speech scroll of the medieval painting, a fact which is surprising because in later sections of the book of Picard, great care was taken to depict the Torah scrolls of the Jewish community in Amsterdam exactly as could be observed in the synagogue. Instead of a Torah ark, the title vignette shows the small scroll and its handle placed on a sort of altar, which is typologically paired with the open codex and the crucifix on the Christian altar. While the artist followed the fictitious model of Christian typology here, he updated the costumes of the Jews. They are wrapped in prayer shawls, talitot, and what might have been most surprising for the Christian viewer are holding prayer books in form of codices, as was customary in the synagogue in Amsterdam. By including the codex in an image of Jewish liturgy, the stark contrast of scroll and codex as marker of religious difference gets another twist. The typology of Christian seeing and Jewish reading without looking at the altar is echoed by the veil behind the Jews. Here you have the veil, you have them reading in their prayer books, but not looking at the altar, whereas the Christian is looking at the cross and the open codex. However, the realistically depicted prayer books and prayer shawls had the potential to undermine the typological model, something we find later in the book. Bernard and Picard were interested in pointing out similarities by difference. The exclusion of book formats as a way of forming religious identity is suspended here by an appropriating gaze at the shared cultic significance of books. Such an approach ultimately leads to questions. How was the Jewish perspective on this differentiating of book formats in the depiction of worship in the synagogue? So let's turn the tables. What role did the codex play in Jewish depictions of synagogue service? When a Jewish pictorial tradition of depicting liturgical practices developed in the 13th century, the scroll had long been established as the only legitimate format to contain the written text of the Torah for the public reading in the rabbinic Judaism. However, this did not exclude other formats of writing for the orally performed prayers, and indeed, from the turn of the millennium, these started to be written down in codices, which were more and more used in the public service. In Ashkenaz, a large mahzor or prayer book in codex format could be placed on the lectern from where the leader of prayer or cantor would conduct the service. We see an early depiction of such a scene in a single leaf of a German mahzor from around 1300. The lectern here is situated in front of the Torah Ark, which is shown with a closed door. In the open codex, we read the opening prayer for the Day of Atonement, exactly this section of the book, which was ornamented by the initial word panel. As Shalef Enyi pointed out, this self-referential depiction of the codex functioned here as a visual marker of the auditory dimension of liturgy, a function similar to the speech scroll in the Christian depiction of the Torah shrine. The combination of Torah Ark and open codex, read by the talit-clad leader of prayer at the lectern, facing the Ark, developed into a sign of divine revelation. The opening of the codex, which is intimately linked here to the Ark, could be mingled with the same revelatory overtones of the open codex which we find in the Christian context. I show here 3 examples of the later Italian development of this iconography in the 15th century. We have already encountered the first one. It is the depiction of the prayer service in a synagogue from an Italian mahzor produced in Reggio d'Emilia in 1466. The members of the congregation are sitting at the reading desks along the sides and in front of the synagogue hall, each with an open prayer book placed before them on a desk. The leader of the prayer service is shown with his back. He is clad in a talit which wraps his shoulders and head in the same way as it does with the prayer leader in the earlier miniature. As Katrin Kogman-Appel has shown, this way to wear the talit communicated the exalted status of the prayer leader. He stands directly in front of the ark under its crown of light. The image alludes to the espousal of the law. The leader may open the ark and enter into the sacred space, as is alluded in his prayers. We do not see the format of the book from which the prayer leader is reading here, but in a similar depiction of the morning service on the Day of Atonement, it is an open codex placed on the desk in immediate proximity to the ark. Once again, the prayer book itself is depicted. Its opening alludes to the opening of the ark because the first benediction in the morning service on the Day of Atonement mentions the opening of the gates of mercy. The arrangement shown here recalls a Torah ark that simultaneously served as a repository of the Torah scroll and as a reading desk for the cantor, Masor. At the ark an ark which combined those two functions was preserved from the synagogue of Modena, exactly at the same region where the illuminated prayer book was produced shortly after the middle of the 15th century. So here you can see this connection between the mahzor on the lectern, the ark, and this is combined in one piece of furniture here. Another mahzor, illuminated some years later, likely in Florence, now preserved in the Zurich Jeselsohn collection, is even more explicit in pairing the open ark and open codex. In the miniature above the initial word panel opening the prayers for the Day of Atonement, the prayer leader points to an open codex with uninscribed leaves beneath an open ark. We cannot see the inside, but the meaning is clear. The opening of the book alludes to the opening of the ark. Here, the open codex is a symbol for the revelation of the Torah to Israel. In the same prayer book, the tablets of the law held by Moses are shown in a strikingly similar way. Ark, open codex, and prayer book are also combined in an ornamented page containing the initial word panel with the word listen. The congregation becomes a symbol for the Sabbath union of Israel and the Torah. 7 young men are depicted, each with a codex in front on the desk. But only one of the 7 codices on the desk is open, standing for the revelation of the law on Sabbath, which is shown above by the arc that combines open doors and open book. A further level of meaning could be implied by the differentiating of oral law, the teachings of the Mishnah, and the written law preserved inside the ark. In later depictions of the instructional song Who Knows One, recited at the Bashavat table, and often depicted in illustrated Haggadah manuscripts from the 18th century, the 5 books of Moses' Torah are paired with the 6 sections of the Mishnah. Whereas Moses' Torah is represented as a scroll, the books of the Mishnah, studied by the Sage, as in the slide on the right, are always shown in codex format. I end with an image that refers us back to the beginning of this lecture. Approximately at the same time when James Tissot imagined Jesus opening a contemporary Torah case in one of the synagogues of Jerusalem, the Orientalist Greek painter Theodoros Ralli painted 7 rabbis in Jerusalem. A closed scroll and several closed codices lie side by side on the table of this congregation. One open scroll held by the rabbi in the center of the picture is prominently displayed. Beside it, without any indication of supremacy, an open codex is intensively studied. The revelatory image of study does not imply a temporal break of book formats. The selective use of scrolls and codices in distorted images reinforced religious distinctions that are countered by the continuing existence of both book formats in the imaginative universe of Judaism and Christianity. To analyze this give and take of imagined book is essential to understand religious identity building for any religious anthropology that looks beyond Jean-Frédéric Bernard. And I think this is one of the reasons we could have Basira exactly for studying these identity building codex and scroll formats. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Wonderful for a wonderful talk, and with rich resonance with both talks, actually rich resonances with several of the talks yesterday. We're running a little bit late, but I'll invite both of you to come up to the front, and maybe we can take one question for each speaker, because the coffee has arrived. So let's have Shreve Simpson here in the front ask the first question.
Thank you, Emine, for such a careful and close reading of these.
Sorry, she's got it. It's on.
It's on.
Okay.
It's on. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you for a close reading of these, of the Murad portraits, and especially for introducing us to these very dense scrolls, which I think possibly because of their size have sort of not made their way into much of the scholarly thinking about Ottoman court manuscript production. But I want to go back to the holding of the book, of Murad's book, and to think about what that book could be. The size of it makes me think of a Quran.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could be more explicit about that, given, and that would reinforce the connection or the symbolism of Murad as a pious ruler. He was actually holding the holy book of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for pointing that out. So of course I don't know for certain what the book is, but because all of us art historians have been approaching Murad as the bibliophile all these years, I assumed it was an illustrated book and, poetry book, because we also see images of rulers being presented, books of history and books of poetry. So I'd always gone in that direction. But now reading through the material that I presented today, I am much more inclined to think that, yes, it probably is a Quran in the way he's holding it. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Thanks again for a wonderful session. I've got a question for Thomas. And, you know, it was a wonderful presentation of the way in which when you put the scroll together, the Jewish scroll together with the Christian codex, that you get this kind of opposition. But I'm thinking of so I'm thinking of three counterexamples, one of which is the evangelists are often depicted throughout the Middle Ages, writing on scrolls as well as on codices. Secondly, that in Taddeo di Bortolo did this amazing paintings in Siena, where he paints the evangelists with scrolls that have Hebrew on them. It's unreadable, but it's recognizable Hebrew. The letters are recognizable, and then they're translated into Latin by the Church Fathers. And so you've got actually an example. And the third example I was thinking of is that with Protestantism, the Geneva Bible in French and English actually have a footnote specifically to the Luke passage, which say that in those days they wrote on scrolls, and that actually therefore they were unfolding or unrolling. So
yeah, thank you very much for this question. My argument would not be that in each case this opposition is put into pictures. My argument is that you have to look at each picture and then define what is the role of the scroll and what is the role of the codex and what role can it play in identity constructions. And you pointed out the evangelist portraits, and of course it is, you're right that on quite a few portraits, especially the animals, the symbols of the evangelists hold scrolls and not codices. But exactly this differentiation between the evangelist writing in a codex-formed book and the animals holding scrolls, referring back to Ezekiel and to the heavenly book revealed, written within and without, is here put into a picture that can be interpreted in a teleological way, but not in this case as an opposition between Judaism and Christianity, but from the heavenly book to its earthly written form. So you really have to look closely at each of these images and then see what is the identity construction behind it.
I think with that, we should break. I know there'll be many more questions for our speakers, but please feel free to ask them during the coffee break, and we'll meet back at 11:40. So just in about 15 minutes. So thank you both to our speakers, and see you at 11:40.